Google and the rest of big tech are back in the sights of Washington. The Trump administration is laying out its plan to launch an antitrust suit against Google, while also pushing to change a law that gives immunity to the social media giants. Hal Singer closely watches tech and antitrust at Econ 1, and he joins us now. Hal, good to see you again. So how concerned should Google be?
I think they should be pretty concerned. The suit is coming, and as you mentioned, the immunity shield that they have used, not just Google, but other dominant tech platforms have used to push off certain liability suits, might be coming down as well.
Hal, I want to turn to that changing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. We know President Trump continues to rail against social media. Now you've got the Justice Department out with its proposal to take away some of those legal protections. Is this really going to make a difference at the end of the day, do you think, for these big tech companies?
Oh, sure, it will. Amazon, just to pick on one, has been successful in part at using that shield to push back certain lawsuits, depending upon the state in which those suits were brought. So I could see a pairing, maybe not exactly along the lines of what the DOJ suggested, but for example, saying that you can no longer use the shield in the sale of physical goods. This was never the intention of Congress originally. It was always about ideas. And so if you're selling a counterfeit Chinese battery that some child swallows, you shouldn't be shielded from the liability suit that would come.
Hal, what would the worst case scenario be for Google in your view?
Well, the worst case for the 230 that we're still talking about. I mean, I presume we're still talking about that. Worst case is that they would now be opened up for lawsuits, depending and being held responsible for the kind of things that are going across the transom on their platform.
Hal, how likely does a breakup of any of these big tech companies look to you, regardless of who's in the White House?
Well, the breakup could come in one of two forms. Everyone thinks that it's going to come potentially at the end of a successful antitrust lawsuit, in 5, 6, 7 years. But a breakup could also come via legislative fiat. When Senator Elizabeth Warren talks about a breakup, she's talking about one that's written into law. Right. And so the question is whether or not she could gather a collection of Democratic senators to get on board with that, and ultimately whether a President Biden would be willing to sign on. But short of the breakup, there are a lot of other remedies that we could enforce, beginning just, for example, with a non-discrimination regime. So which would be another regulatory solution. So it could happen, but it's probably a low likelihood event.
But Hal, a breakup of a Google, a Facebook, you name it, wouldn't that just cause another entity that has a significant amount of power too?
Well, it could open up the possibility for a new entity to move in. I don't know if it would open up the possibility for a new entity to come in and monopolize the way that Google has. So I think it's a very viable and plausible and elegant solution. And it ought to be on the table alongside other less invasive remedies, including, for example, this non-discrimination regime that I spoke of.
Which big tech company is most at risk? Is it a Google that would make most sense to be broken up? Is it Facebook?
Well, Facebook, it's difficult to think about the different parts of Facebook. One natural thing we could do is that we could go roll back all the acquisitions that Facebook made. But I think that what's very interesting is that Facebook defies convention. The way that Google has gotten into the content space and now leverages its platform power into content, we can take care of that with either a structural solution or a behavioral solution, non-discrimination. Amazon, the same thing. They've used the private labels to kind of leverage their platform power and steer users into search of their own wares, and everyone recognizes that's unfair. And again, it lends itself to these very traditional forms of relief, either structural separation along those product lines or a non-discrimination regime. When you come to Facebook, what it's doing, it's the way that it's kind of propagating misinformation, causing extremism, undermining democracy. It largely defies kind of these conventional tools. And so I think we have to think about Facebook in a very different way, including just dismantling the entire business practice, potentially banning, for example, targeted advertising. This is a whole different animal, something we've really never confronted before. And Facebook may not be allowed to exist in its current form under a new regime.
Hal, before I let you go, back on the Google potential antitrust suit, how long would it take before a decision is rendered down. Are we looking at a decade here? Is it a year? What's typical for something like this?
Antitrust is slow. I mean, I did an analysis that looked at cases that I think ended around 2000. And even then, just to get a resolution in the lower court, the district court, took you on the order of 3.5 years. But if you're talking about appeals to a federal court and then ultimately up to the Supreme Court, we could be looking at 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so the problem here that I keep stressing is that we cannot wait 7, 8 years to solve this innovation problem. If we're worried that Google is leveraging its power into the edge and making it difficult for independent content creators to survive and thrive, we cannot wait 7 years. And so I've been pushing, even alongside a suit, I've been pushing for a regulatory solution that would bring some relief to the edge, in our lifetime.
All right, we'll leave it there. Hal Singer of Econ 1, always good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for having me.